Good afternoon. This case is a tragedy in death and a tragedy in life. You will hear from Dr. Toomer, who's been practicing 40 years, and he will tell you that he does not believe in the death penalty. And he will tell you, because in his experience, it's not fairly applied. He's African American.
Objection, relevance.
They opened the door. When Markeith was 7 years old, somehow, some way, he was able to watch Roots in Mississippi burning. And the questions that arose in his mind about the white man and the treatment of his people continued on throughout his life. And you're going to hear, and I'm going to tell you in a moment, that much of that is based in delusional thinking. He grew up in Carver Hill, moved to Pines Hills, would hang out on Orange Blossom, and at some point, like many young African American boys, he started selling drugs. His family didn't have much money, and he became the caretaker of his family. He would steal food and obviously get into conflict with the police. And the more the conflict grew with consistency, the more that he believed he was being targeted because of the color of his skin. Racism lived in his community here in Orlando. Him and his family saw members of the KKK marching by his house. In 1995, he was falsely accused and ultimately exonerated of a... In 1999, he went to prison. He went to federal prison till 2014. The original sentence was crack cocaine, and ultimately his sentence was reduced some.
Objection, relevance.
Thank you. And after spending that lengthy time in prison for the drug charges, he got out of prison in 2014 with the hope in his mind of a fresh start. He ended up getting many jobs, including delivering chicken, which he was robbed twice. And throughout 2014, all the way up to late 2016, he continued to work. He had a house, he had girlfriends, he had family that he helped out. But The thought process that was created when he was 7 years old never went away. When Mr. Loyd was arrested on this charge, the police seized 30,000 pages of Facebook musing by Mr. Loyd. You're going to get to see some of that during this trial. And it will be clear to you that he's vocal about feeling that he's enslaved by the white man, that he's not a Martin Luther King, that he will fight violence with violence, and that he believes and follows accurately to the detail, and Dr. Toomer will tell you this, every one of the black males and black boy and women who have been killed by police officers. You will hear that even shortly after he was released from prison, he asked his sister Tanya to take out an insurance policy on him because he was convinced.
Relevance.
He was convinced that the police were going to kill him. So what are we dealing with here with Markeith Loyd? He doesn't think he's ill. He doesn't think he's mentally ill. That's called anosognosia. It's when a mentally ill person doesn't realize they're mentally ill. But he is. And actually about 30% of people who are mentally ill suffer from this issue. And you will hear from Dr. Toomer about that. Dr. Toomer will tell you that Mr. Loyd suffering the effects of underlying neurological impairment, major mental illnesses, PTSD, psychosis, and schizophrenia spectrum disorder, reflected in paranoid ideation, disturbance in thought process, delusional disorder, and anosognosia. Dr. Toomer will tell you that he believes, pursuant to the insanity instruction, that Mr. Loyd has a mental illness, and that although he knew what he was doing and its consequences at the time of killing Lieutenant Clayton, he did not know it was wrong. And he will explain that to you. But I want to talk about only a part of what Dr. Toomer is going to tell you. I want to talk about delusional disorder. Delusional disorder is a fixed false belief that is not amenable to logic. It's important that you remember this, and Dr. Toomer will explain. A fixed false belief that is not amenable to logic. That's what this gentleman has. You read his Facebook, that's what you'll see. He does not interpret things the way we interpret things. He has a fixed delusional system. And part of that is he believes, truly believes, that the police are going to kill him. That never changes. The heightened part of it does change, because you will hear that with fixed delusional thinking, these false beliefs can be heightened by stressors that will cause a person to react in a more significant way. It kind of makes sense when we're talking about stressors generally. I mean, we act differently when we're under stress. But there was an event that occurred in December that was a huge stressor to Mr. Loyd. And after this event, he was hiding in the woods, hiding in abandoned buildings, hiding generally. Didn't leave Orlando, he stayed here. And at some point you will hear that as this fixed false belief continued, as it did, and as it was, even before all of these events, that he was able to obtain a bulletproof vest while he was on the streets after this event had occurred. And he believed that was a sign from God. Now I want to talk about Walmart. Ed, can you help me out? You have great responsibility here in listening to the evidence and viewing everything very carefully, because I suggest to you some of it may be distorted. This is the front of the Walmart where the shooting occurred. Mr. Loyd had gone there because he was living in the woods and wanted food and water and to use the bathroom. And as you heard, at some point he was recognized by Miss Bryant, who knew who he was, and that he was being looked for, and that she went outside to talk to Lieutenant Clayton. I would suggest that Lieutenant Clayton did not know who Markeith Loyd was. She was told about a murder case, but even as she was walking up to him, she wasn't absolutely sure. There had been no confirmation from radio dispatch, and all she was relying on was Miss Bryant. But you could judge that for yourself, because I'm going to give you, if they don't give you, the radio transmissions where you hear her talking on the radio and literally walking up to where Mr. Loyd was. And if you see that portion, if you remember that portion of the video they showed you, you don't have a lot of camera footage at the very entrance of the store. You have a door that people come in and go out. At that entrance, I think it's the pharmacy grocery area, if I remember correctly. Pharmacy grocery area. And what you see is, you see Mr. Loyd pushing the cart, and there's some film, I don't think they showed it to you all, but there's some film that shows she is walking with her hand on the gun and in the radio. And what you hear her say is they're asking questions. I think somebody from her unit, because she was in charge of a unit of officers, was asking, what's going on? Because she sent out an emergency signal. There's no question she sent out an emergency signal. And she says something like, well, walking up, there's apparently a Markeith Loyd, he's wanted for killing. And that's when she is walking up where you see her. because that's all she says at that point. Seconds are important. 8 seconds between that dispatch and her beginning to run in front of the building after Mr. Loyd flees. And what you hear after 8 seconds is emergency pursuit, bang, bang, bang. 3 shots. And that's all. Then if you watch the video that picks up from this area that shows this, and then you have a rooftop camera that shows down, which you saw part of. She's running along this area, and he's running behind this area. And what Mr. Loyd does, he's running. No gun. He didn't have a gun on him when he left to run away, and he didn't have a gun on him when he's over in this area. But what you see is him come around here, and he's running. And you'll see over here, I think I got a better... What you'll see is that she's running. Thank you. Appreciate it. She's running from the front here. He's running from behind here. Now, what you'll note is that when you see this, see where his body is turned? This is probably the first time he draws his weapon. She's here.
Objection, Your Honor, argument.
If you look at this, you'll see what the positions are as hands. The evidence is going to show that what happened was Mr. Loyd was running this way, next to this banister, and then he saw her, and he decided to change directions. So he comes around here. The evidence is going to show, we believe, that she fired at him. And that when she fired at him, he turns around, and that's the first time he pulls his gun. So he's being fired upon by Lieutenant Clayton. And you don't have to, believe me, if you look at the video carefully, and I'm going to introduce some videos, and they're going to introduce some videos, there is no question that he is not armed while he runs this way.
Objection, argument.
So what happens then? There's a gun battle. There's a gun battle between Lieutenant Clayton and Markeith Loyd. She's firing at him. He's firing at her. When she realizes, the evidence shows that at some point after this position here, where she's coming this way, she backs off and goes that way, which you saw in the video. So she changes the direction. But by that time, she has her gun out and he has his gun out. And they're firing at each other. How do we know they're firing at each other? This is something I got from the state. I'm sure they're going to introduce it to you. This is essentially the evidence that they plan on putting on that shows where each casing is. Where each casing is from what gun. Now, she had the 9mm Luger. He had the .40 Smith & Wesson. What you see here is Exhibit K is a 9mm bullet. There's one thing important. There's one casing missing because the police are trained to keep 16 bullets in their gun, and when her gun is checked, counting the ones that were fired, which were 8, she fired 8 shots during this period of time. And they found 7 bullets. That's 15, and there was 1 missing. And Detective Cadiz, who's the lead detective, will tell you that he found that out. Now, what is the biggest problem in this case? Besides you looking at evidence and making an evaluation of the evidence, and we'll get, at the end of the trial, get to talk to you about what our arguments are. But there's a big problem here, and that problem will come to fruition during the trial. There is a conflict with Orlando Police Department in this investigation. Is it one that we should be taken back about? No. Because everyone loved Lieutenant Clayton, including the lead detective in this case. And it was a terrible, terrible loss for everyone at the Orlando Police Department and the entire community of Orlando. Don't make any mistake. There's never going to be a question about that. There'll be other questions, but never a question about how well respected Lieutenant Clayton was. But what you're going to find out is that when the police start to piece things together, Detective Cadiz admits, after we found out, that he actually, when he put together a collage of the videos, going step by step by step, that he intentionally left out the one that shows Markeith running unarmed here and then turning. Left completely out. And that is the beginning of the conflict we see. I told you there was a casing missing, that was ignored. There was a projectile that was found on the other side of the parking lot. So there's another part down here. And that projectile was found after crime scene left the area. And so instead of bringing the main crime scene detective back to photograph it, show where it's at, collect it, they sent another detective just to collect it. And I would suggest that the evidence supports that that is a projectile that could have been fired by Lieutenant Clayton. You'll hear how Detective Cadiz will admit on their direct that he spoke terribly to Markeith. Told him he deserves the respect of a rabid dog. That's what the lead detective said to Mr. Loyd. Is that fair? It may be fair for someone who lost a loved one, who is angry and hateful, believing that he took the life of...
Argument.
Sustain.
But this anger and hate, you will see, goes even further. Because the chief of police won't stop talking about it on the news.
Objection.
Sustained.
Ultimately, there is a significant manhunt for Mr. Loyd. Leave no bar undone. $100,000 reward. Vilified.
Argument.
Sustained.
And so, at some point, they're able to trace Mr. Loyd's phone through a wiretap that is being conducted. And on those wiretaps, they're able to capture conversation with Mr. Loyd, a friend of his, and his brother. And Mr. Loyd tells them that
Objection. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
And so ultimately, after he is taken, or when they find him, Mr. Loyd puts himself in a position to surrender, waves a flag,
Objection.
Sustained.
and surrenders. Now, in terms of the investigation, I want you to pay attention to the incident with Captain Carter. So the incident with Captain Carter is, as you remember from the state, that Carter pulls up pretty close to where Mr. Loyd is, and Mr. Loyd gets out and shoots at him. He shoots the passenger tire. And Carter's never even out of his car at that point. So there's no question that he shoots, but where he shoots becomes important. And the evidence about that becomes important. There is no question that Mr. Loyd at that time, that he fired those shots, believed that Lieutenant Clayton was trying to kill him. That information is supported through Dr. Toomer's findings and through the evidence that you see.
Objection. Argument.
Sustained. Rephrase.
That the law the judge reads to you will describe for you so you can make the appropriate decision. And when it's all done, Mr. Loyd is going to be found guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity. And the reason not guilty by reason of insanity is because of Dr. Toomer's testimony. And there may be more. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Lenamon. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to send you all to the hotel, get a good dinner, get a good rest. We will start back up with testimony tomorrow morning at 9:30. The state will present their case first. I'll see you then. Have a good evening, folks. Leave your notebooks on your chairs, please.